40 عاما من المقاومة المسلحة في مناطق متعددة من الهند، إنها من أكبر الصراعات المتجاهلة خارج الحدود الهندية. إنها الحرب الصامتة من داخل الهند. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. هي باحثة وأستاذة في معهد تاتا للعلوم الاجتماعية في الهند، أحد أكبر معاهد العلوم الاجتماعية في العالم. تنقلت في الشرق الأوسط في مناطق النزاع والحرمان والمقاومة، من بغداد إلى فلسطين المحتلة كناشطة في حركة السلام الدولية في العراق وفلسطين. هي الهندية بيلا باتيا التي عاشت وما زالت تعيش حالة من البحث الميداني في أنحاء عدة من الهند موطنها. أبحاثها تمحورت حول الحركات الشعبية وحقوق الإنسان والسلام والديمقراطية، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بالمناطق الريفية مثل بيهار وجاركند وكوجرات وراجستان وغيرها. شاركت في تأليف كتاب عن وضع النساء في العراق إبان الحرب وعن العقوبات في التسعينيات، وكتاب آخر عن الحرب والسلم في منطقة الخليج عام 2001. كتبت الأستاذة باتيا مقالات عدة عن الإخلاءات القسرية في منطقة وادي نرمادا وعن حركة النكسلايت في بيهار، وهي مظلة تضم عددا من الجماعات الشيوعية الماوية التي نشأت في سياق النزاع الصيني السوفيتي، منحازة إلى الجانب الصيني وأيديولوجية الرئيس الصيني آنذاك ماو تسي تونغ. وقد تصاعد تأثيرها بعد نهاية الحرب الباردة، وهي تتمركز بالأساس في ولاية البنغال الغربية، وخاصة في المنطقة المعروفة باسم حزام نكسال، وهي تعد من المواضيع الشائكة في الهند منذ 40 عاماً والمتجاهلة خارج حدود الهند. ماذا تكشف لنا الأستاذة باتيا عن الأصوات غير المسموعة للنساء في العراق خلال الحرب والعقوبات، وعن أوجه الشبه بين ما يجري في مناطق محددة في الهند وفي فلسطين المحتلة، وعن حقوق الشعب الفلسطيني، وكيف تقارب المسألة الكشميرية؟ Social and political researcher Dr. Bella Bhattia, welcome to The Inside. Well, you have been engaged in fieldwork and research in various places and states in India, like in Bihar, in Gujarat, in Jharkhand, among others.
Yes.
Where did your research take you, and what did it actually focus on?
Well, basically my emphasis has been to try to understand the situation of our people in all these various different states, because often the mainstream media does not focus enough on the human condition of the really deprived sections of the Indian population. Now here I'm mainly speaking about the Dalits, that is the so-called, they are part of the scheduled castes, and the Adivasis, that is the indigenous people of India.
The inhabitants of India.
Yes.
Yes.
And the Dalits and the Adivasis together, they make roughly 25% of the Indian population, and in actual numbers they are the size of America. So like it's huge, it's a huge population. And these are at the really the lowest rungs of our democracy in terms of basic economic, social and democratic rights.
Why did you decide to embark on such a research?
Well, basically the research itself has been on many different issues. Like, on the one hand, I've been trying to understand the movements that the people have themselves given shape to in order to assert their rights. So as part of that, I've researched on movements which have been working within the democratic rights framework, as well as movements
like, for example?
Like as part of, like those who are working within the democratic rights are people who use non-violent means. And as part of that, for example, you have movements like the movement of the Adivasis in Jharkhand against the Koil Karo Dam. Similarly, there was a movement that I was part of for 5 years in rural North Gujarat, This was in a place called Sabarkantha district, where the working population of this area, they fought for land for many years, and they were able to get 1,300 acres of land. And then finally, they were able to build agricultural cooperative societies and, cultivate the land together.
Right.
And that's a very significant kind of an example, which in fact you don't find in other parts of the country, where just cooperation has brought people together across, like they are different, like socially they are different. They are Dalits, they are, Adivasis, they are lower, amongst the lower backward castes, but they have come together and, they fought for land.
How many castes actually do we have in India?
Well, I mean, there are many castes, but what is...
It's not only an upper class or a lower class, but we have lots of other castes.
No, in the sense that, see, when we say the upper caste or the lower caste, we are also talking about not only caste, but we are also talking about class.
Yes.
And because we have, like there are 4 varnas. And
the priests and the merchants and the farmers and
yes,
what else?
Yes, and the manual laborers.
Yes,
and then there are the the untouchables who are actually outside the varna. So they are actually known as avarna. So they are absolutely at the lowest, in the caste hierarchy. And the Constitution of India very clearly states that there can be no discrimination amongst, the people, and they should all receive, they are equal citizens, and they are, entitled to equal rights, equal opportunities in this country. Is this the
case really on the ground after your research?
No, that is the whole point, that this is not actually, like on the ground, most of these people are still struggling for the basic rights. Like, often they are just struggling just for survival. There's a widespread hunger, there's widespread malnourishment. Their, entitlements to land, for example, they don't have. So, for example, in places like Bihar, when I was studying there, in districts like Gaya, you have something like 30 to 40% of the population is of agricultural laborers. So these are people who are, for their daily survival, they are functioning like they are, working the fields of the landlord. And most of the time they are receiving wages that are much below the basic minimum. So actually it is this kind of a situation that has given rise to a lot of the movements, especially the, amongst the peasantry, like led to a lot of unrest and movements. And as I was telling earlier, some of them are functioning within the democratic rights framework, but there are others who have taken to armed resistance.
Do you advocate armed resistance?
Well, my own position is that it is really the right of the oppressed to decide, because I am not the person who is oppressed, and I have not suffered that for generations and for centuries. So it is really, I think it is the right of the oppressed people.
Here I want to ask you, please, for how long have you been researching this area, these regions, so to say?
Well, since the mid 1990s, as an academic.
As an academic.
But before that, when I was working as a full-time activist.
Have you stopped researching the area?
No, I mean, I'm continuing my research because, as I said, these are all very similar kind of issues and questions, though it may take me to different states. But I would like to mention that even earlier, when I was working as an activist in North Gujarat, I was also writing on the issues that I had, that we were struggling against.
Right.
Yeah.
Before the mid-1990s, you also went to Iraq.
Yes.
And you've done your research there, and you also co-authored a book called Unheard Voices, Iraqi Women on War and Sanctions. What have you learned, Bella, from this experience?
Well, that was a very moving experience for me, because we were, as part of the Gulf Peace team, we were in Iraq even before the war. And because we were basically trying to set up a peace camp on the border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And this was an effort of an international team of, we defined ourselves as ordinary people, like we were not part of any kind of big peace organizations. We were just ordinary people who were trying to say no to war and saying that it is ultimately the ordinary human being, who is going to be suffering, and that the states should learn to dialogue with each other instead of resorting to war. So actually I was part of the advanced team of 7 which went into Iraq and we stayed in Baghdad, and we were negotiating with the Iraqi authorities to allow us to pitch a camp on the no person's land between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And that time, whatever parts of Baghdad I could visit and see, one did not see poverty in Baghdad. One did not see beggars in Baghdad. There was, like in terms of the infrastructure, one could very, very clearly see that Iraq had made, very significant strides. Yeah, yes. It was quite an advanced kind of a, country. But it is after the war that I really saw the inhumanity of that war, where one could see that during that war, and I'm talking of the first Gulf War. This is 1991, the war which started on 16 January 1991, and how they very specifically targeted the infrastructure. Like they targeted bridges, they targeted roads, they targeted electricity installations, and so on.
This is the second Gulf War, we call it.
Sorry.
After the war with Iran, which is considered as the first Gulf War.
Okay.
Yes.
So that time I could actually see how it was, done so purposefully to really take back an entire society,
to drive it backwards.
Backwards in time. And post Iraq war, like as part of this research, along with 2 women from Iraq, from Amman.
From Jordan.
From Jordan. I traveled through the length and breadth of Iraq that time, and we talked to 80 Iraqi women about the effect of war and sanctions on them. And that time I could really see the extent of devastation that the war had caused to the people of Iraq.
And to the women in particular.
And especially the women. Now this is important because all along what was being said and stated by the Allied forces was that this war is not against the people of Iraq. That is what they were claiming. But on the ground, it is the people that who are being hurt the most. Now let us take the example of inflation, for example, like of ordinary items, like whether it be sugar, whether it be ordinary food that people eat, and that
flour,
time, yes, flour, rice. Like it was 50-50, it was 50 times, 70 times the original, what was in the pre-war time. So I've been witness to how people were literally forced to sell furniture. There were women who were selling their bridal, what they
dress,
wear, bridal dress. So every, whatever could fetch them some money. So it was,
they would just sell it in order to get
in order to get that.
Yeah.
For the first time, we saw beggars on the streets, and even women, completely covered in with the
veil.
With the veil, yeah. And I remember this very sort of a sight which has stayed with me, where this woman is completely covered, and it's only her hand that you can,
see begging on the streets of Baghdad.
So this is what actually, and this plus the sanctions, which really was a war against the children of Iraq. Right. Especially because where they did not even allow basic, medicine for the children, and for everybody, but it hurt the children, and we have seen the thousands of children who died as a result.
Right, Dr. Bella, Batiya, we're going to stop now for a short break, and then after we're back, we're going to talk about the parallels between your research in India, in the rural areas of India, and whatever you've researched in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine. You've been there back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Right, a short break, and we'll be back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Inside with social and political activist Dr. Bella Batiya. Dr. Bella Batiya, let's get back to talk about the parallels between your study of the rural areas in Gujarat and other places, and the parallels of what is going on in the Middle East, like in Palestine and Iraq. You've researched these places. How can we draw these parallels?
Well, I think I'd like to talk about Palestine a little bit.
Yes.
For example, now in Palestine, what we saw was that it was a people and a land under occupation, and which has been under occupation, a merciless occupation for decades. There are some images which stand in my mind about how in the outside the old city, Palestinian youth can be stopped anytime, and they are constantly asked for their IDs. Likewise, everywhere there are these checkpoints, and there is all kinds of like I remember once I was coming back from another place in a bus, and I saw somebody lying on the streets, and he was apparently stabbed, and he was just lying on the streets. This is very close to East Jerusalem. Likewise, for example, I remember how at 8 o'clock in the night in East Jerusalem, it looked like completely a place in darkness where, only a cat, like I remember once when I was coming from this office that, they'd given us shelter when we were planning our walk for a peaceful future.
You were there part of your activism, part of the international movement, peace movement, of Palestine movement.
Yes, I got to spend something like 6 months in Palestine. This was in January, from January to June 1992. And the whole idea was that we were, after our activism in Iraq, we had links with peace-minded people in 20 countries. And by that time, we felt that we also wanted to speak out against the occupation of Palestine. So therefore, we had organized a peace walk for the 6 days of the war. The 1967 war.
6-day war.
Yes, the 6-day war. And our 3 slogans were end the occupation, 2 states for a peaceful future, and respect human rights. So it is with this, that is the time when I was, I got to spend
What about the right of the refugees to return to their homeland?
No, very much. I mean, they're all the Palestinians who have been in the diaspora and, who have a right to return back to their own homes.
Right.
Who have a right to their identity. They have a right to their sovereignty, because that is, in terms of the sense of self, that's a very, crucial and an important part about who you are. And the fact that, the kind of force that has been used, the illegitimate means that have been, used to continuously repress the Palestinians, by the Israelis and the United States. This is, particularly deplorable.
Yes.
And even when I was there, I was witness to how houses were, demolished. The number of, because even as part of our peace team, when we walked, they allowed us to walk through the Israeli territories, but in Jenin they arrested all of us. So something like more than 120 people were arrested and kept in the, in different prisons in Israel.
Detention centers.
And we were given like 15 days that, in those 15 days we had to leave the country. Now, of course, we were, even in prison, treated quite well. But we could see the Palestinians who were in prison, and the prisons were flooded by the Palestinians. So, you cannot keep, like, I think there's a very basic message here that whatever you want for your own self, the way you want to live, you also have to grant that to the others. And unfortunately here you were talking of parallels. I feel sad to say that as an Indian citizen, I cannot say that India has always done that with respect to the aspirations of other nationalities in India. Like for example, if I mention the Kashmiris, now Kashmiris have been waging a long battle, and a long struggle.
For self-determination?
Basically for self-determination, and for realizing the promise that India made to Kashmiris, about a referendum, about a plebiscite, and including to the United Nations and so on. I mean, it's a long story, so I won't go into it. But again, about how the promises are not kept, how elections are rigged, how people are forced to take to militancy in 1989, and how more than 100,000 people lose their lives and have been killed. large-scale human rights violations that have happened in the valley, from custodial torture to rapes to even now mass graves are being have been found, and so on. And you come to a point in 2010 where the people actually now when the militancy is almost at its lowest ebb, and the government of India is accepting that now we only have something like 300 to 400 militants in the Kashmir Valley. But in terms of the armed forces there, we still have roughly the ratio is that you have something like 7 to 8 for 7 to 8 Kashmiris you have one soldier. And I think it is the most militarized region in the entire world. Now this kind of a situation cannot be kept and should not be kept. It's immoral, illegal to keep it going like that.
How do you find a solution for the situation?
No, I think the people of Kashmir are trying to point towards a solution, because for example in 2010 I was there again as part of a fact-finding team, and we were investigating the deaths of 117 youth who were killed by the armed forces while they were just throwing stones. So in fact that was the Kashmiri Intifada, which started in 2010. And here this was not bullets, this was just stones. And
just like the Palestinian Intifada.
Like the Palestinian, but that stone throwing was met with bullets. And the youngest person to die was somebody called Samir, who was just 8 years old. And most of the, those who were killed were between 8 to 25 years. And besides the 117 who actually lost their lives, there were around more than 500 who were injured, and they had bullet injuries. So actually what it means is that they could have also been amongst those who could have been killed.
Right.
And there's been no justice done. I mean, they have been given some compensatory, amount, which most of them have refused. They have refused to take that compensation from the Indian government. And the Kashmiris today are talking about Azadi, but we need to understand what do they mean by that Azadi. At one point, freedom. Everywhere this time in 2010 when I went, everywhere you could see, we want freedom. Written on the walls, written on the roads.
And actually this was the essence of a movie made by Sanjay Kark. It's called Jashan Azadi or something.
Yes, and I think it is very important to respect the aspirations, the desires of a people. What do they want?
Because they have the right for self-determination.
Exactly.
I think now we have to make a special edition only for the Basta region and your research there. It's very important. It's very important for the people in the Middle East to know about this sort of conflict and the armed resistance and everything. But I'm afraid that we ran short of time. Professor Bella Bاتيا, social and political researcher, many thanks indeed for this interview from the Institute of Social Sciences, one of the leading institutes in the developed region. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة، ودائما المقاربة تكون من الداخل. من حسين نصار، بسام خطار، ومن زينب الصفار. إلى اللقاء.